Welcome everyone to this afternoon's session of the Levelling Up Housing and Communities Select Committee. This afternoon we're looking at the OFLOG, which is the Office for Local Government, which the government has set up. I'm trying to phrase it correctly, to oversee or keep an eye on the finances and working of local councils. But we'll explore precisely what that means in due course with our witnesses. To begin with, I just ask committee members, and apologise that there are only a few of us this afternoon. There's a statement on Gaza which many members are in the chamber for this afternoon. But we'll ask committee members to put on record their interest that may be relevant to this inquiry. I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association.
I am also a Vice President of the Local Government Association, and I employ a councillor in my office.
Okay, right, that's our interest, and now over to the more interesting part of the session with our witnesses. And perhaps just go down the table and ask you just to say who you are and the organisation you're here on behalf of this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Chair. Rob Whiteman, Chief Executive of CIPFA.
You want to tell us what CIPFA is for those who may not know? We all know, of course, but that's, yes.
I hope I can remember. It's the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy.
Laurence, Ferry, I'm Professor and Accountant at Durham University.
And I'm Ed Hammond, I'm the Deputy Chief Executive at the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny.
Okay, thank you all for coming this afternoon to this issue, which may seem a bit dry and technical, but clearly the whole issue of local government finance and the problems that councils have got at present, and the number of councils effectively declaring bankruptcy and that more that may be declaring bankruptcy is a big issue for the public as well as councils themselves. So exploring what OFLOG is going to do is quite important. So first question to all of you. OFLOG said its priorities are to inform the public, warn local authorities of risks, support local authorities to mitigate these risks, all of which seem very worthy. Are these the right priorities? And if so, are some more important than others in your view? Rob, do you want to go down the table?
Thank you very much. So I think we welcome the clarity of OFLOG saying what it will do, as you just said, Chair. Possibly the strength of what they've said, there's a flip side weakness to it, which is these are a fairly limited set of things given the enormity of the challenges facing local government. However, it is welcome that there is clarity on the few things that they will focus on, because I think the sector is worried about another layer of bureaucracy or regulation. And so to run through your list, high quality data, I think everybody would feel is a good thing, but that raises questions about the degree to which it will originate data or the degree to which it will collate other people's data. Raising warnings with councils is a complicated landscape because the LGA help councils through their peer review. Bodies like CIPFA help local authorities. So I think there's a question about how will that support fit in with the other things that take place. And then as you move along the line, the improvement support that it may give. My reading of it is it's very data focused and it's sticking to being a data body. But if it does start to get into deeper support for councils, then I think there would be questions about does that overlap with what other people do. So in summary, we all think data is a good thing, and personally I think OFLOG coordinating data is a good thing. However, it is a fairly limited scope, and I think we're all keen that it doesn't become a body that means different things to different people, and there's almost as much discussion about what OFLOG won't do as to what it will do, and it's quite a contentious field, and so I think all of it will need more clarity.
Yeah, just looking at the corporate plan, which is in draft, out for consultation, they actually say they'll help local government perform, and that's in the context of localism and sector-led improvement. And they obviously have the three areas that you mentioned, inform, warn and support. But even when you look at those, they have problems. So if you look at first inform, if you look at the data that they're providing at the moment, it's not really value for money data. It's very basic KPIs. that you would have seen for a long time ago, key performance indicators. So they never take it forward to look in detail at services like best value would have. They certainly don't look at an organisation like comprehensive performance assessment would have. And they don't look at an area or a place like comprehensive area assessment would have. And yet in the document it says that they'll help local government be place-based leaders. That's impossible with the data that they have. And the other problem that you would also have there is how would they assess the performance and value for money anyway, given that they've got no value for money audit expertise, and it specifically says that they won't have a place within local audit.
Oh, so not much use then?
Not really. I mean, if you're honest on this, they've done a good job in the straitjacket that they put in, but then within the straitjacket that they're in, they talk about a lot of things that they'll not do, and I'll not read them all off, but they won't lobby, they won't arbitrate, they won't have routine inspections, they won't intervene like a regulator, and they'll not make any policy on external audit. So if you start looking at everything that they won't do, what's left? A bit of performance, data collection, and then you could say that's really doing what other people already do, and maybe not in as much detail.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think that understanding the role and responsibility involves looking at the place of Oflog within the wider assurance framework and understanding its position amongst the various other different organisations, ourselves and CIPFA included, in assuring performance and assuring quality of service delivery and assuring good governance in the sector at large. And I think as long as you do that and don't look at its role in isolation, I think you see there's an important complementary role that it can perform. But I think that complementary role is driven in part by data, but more by the need for government, through Oflog, potentially to gain a more valuable insight into the challenges, constraints and opportunities that local government faces. So financial particularly, but also more broadly around governance, prioritisation, these kinds of things. I think government badly needs a sort of centre of expertise and excellence that could be Oflog to give it a level of insight, a level of mature and sophisticated insight into councils, their needs, their challenges, their constraints that currently, arguably, it doesn't have. Now, that is a stretch on what government has already set out Oflog's role will be, but I think in practice, I think that's the only obvious space in which it can occupy, where it would be contributing something of value, that would be, of use to government and to the sector more widely.
What you're saying really is it's a body there to help government understand.
I think it can and should be. I think at the moment part of the issue is that the role hasn't been, I think, sufficiently described in a positive way. As Laurence was saying, there's much there about what it isn't going to do as what it is. I think because the things it's trying to tackle are primarily about subjective understanding, really, about the constraints and issues that local government faces, about our financial resilience, around financial constraints, around constraints about a capability to change, capability of transformation, because that's what some of the productivity work that it's going to be doing, hopefully, will be focused on. As much of this has to be about government getting a better grip at itself on how is that going to help government perform its stewardship role for the sector more effectively. So government obviously has the important best value duties to perform. Oflog could play an important formal role in helping government to understand how local authorities collectively and individually are able to fulfil their best value duty. But I think there's a value in it helping the sector and helping government to get a better thematic understanding of some of those pressures, how they're being surfaced, what we're doing about them. I think where it potentially falls down is where we start to see it being used as a mechanism to look at the capability of individual local authorities and then try and manage improvement in those local authorities, which is an extremely resource-intensive task and ends up stepping on the toes of organisations like the LGA, like to an extent CIPFA, other membership organisations as well.
Is it actually going to do anything that other organisations currently don't do?
Well, it overlaps with some of us. So CIPFA, LGA and others produce data. For example, we produce CIPFA stats and benchmarking clubs. I assume that this is an area that Offlog may in time move into because it wants to ensure high quality data, but will it rely on CIPFA data or will it produce the data itself? I think is the point I was making at the beginning about what will its model be for ensuring high quality data. Will it do it itself or will it rely on the data that others produce as well?
I think the problem is it's a completely fragmented space to look at the accountability and audit landscape, and therefore it's difficult for Offlog to find out where it actually fits in. And so all of the corporate plan really talks about a look at performance to help local government or to inform citizens. That would be possibly a useful intermediary role, but it still comes back to the problem. You have no system leader for the whole accountability and audit landscape.
Yeah, I think that there's potentially value for Offlog to bring together that existing data and with others work through and seek to have a more holistic understanding of where, as I say, pressures and constraints lie. But as Rob has said, the key issue here is Offlog going to create its own data set or is it going to use the data produced by others? My own personal sense, our sense, would be it should be collating and bringing together data produced by others. I don't think there'd be much value in having a new separate data set over here complementing or cutting across what others are doing. And the fact is that there is a lot of data out there. There is data produced by the LGA, the LGA's LG Inform service. There's CIPFA, obviously, has produced its data analytics, has its data analytics service, and others as well, other government departments. To record data. We don't want for data. There are issues probably about quality and about consistency, but there'd be far more value for Offlog in bringing that together, seeing what thematic lessons we can learn from what that data tells us, than saying we're going to create a whole new set of metrics over here to measure a range of connected things to what other people are measuring.
So when asked, the NJ did a survey of local authority officials, and only 8% thought Offlog would be effective, and 62% thought it would be scrapped. It's not a great position to start from, is it?
Well, it's a difficult time, isn't it? I think we have to remember that there's a lot of other things happening in local government. We see the position that 19 local authorities would have gone bust if they were not allowed to capitalise their revenue gap. That's quite a lot. And if that were double the number in a year's time, if 10 or 15% of the sector were in effect bankrupt but for changing accounting treatment, this is quite an interesting time to launch Offlog, isn't it? Because from council's perspective, yes, the sector would like information on best practice, the sector would like information on productivity and efficiency, but there are councils that probably need finance reform and more quantum as well. In those 19 authorities, I see one or two well-run authorities. You know, Chair, I've never hidden from criticising authorities that are badly managed when they've gone wrong, but we are now at the cusp where some good authorities were amongst that number that needed a capitalisation order. So for Offlog to get this right and have this judgment of Solomon on productivity and efficiency, where probably most people think finance reform is important as well, is quite difficult for it to get right, which I think is why it's taken such a narrow scope, because it's difficult to do anything more than the narrow set of things that it's set for itself.
Right, just one question for me, then I'll move on. Do you think the public is going to be better informed as a result of Offlog?
No. I mean, at the moment, there couldn't really be, could there? Because the data that's actually published through things like the Data Explorer isn't in the kind of detail that they would need. And there's no intermediary really saying what that data means. If you think over the last 10 years, the local media has disappeared primarily in this country with things like the internet. And so who's going to assess that data for them? You've got no audit commission. So unless Offlog actually do that, who's going to actually analyse that data for the public? That's the problem.
Okay. Mary.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm just going to keep on the issue of data and just ask the straight question. Should Oflog be involved in using the outputs of local authority audits at all? How should this data sharing, if you like, be conducted?
So, to just, if I may just say something, whilst we're discussing Oflog today, I can't stress enough that the most important reform is to get local public audit right again. And Ofsted has a fairly limited role in what it will do, and therefore its impact may be limited. But what's happened to local government audit is just terrible. And we really, really, really need good local public audit again. Now, collating data is useful, that particularly setting standards on how that data should be set. If we look at data sets for different parts of the public sector, the amplitude, the difference on some local authority data sets, isn't real, that people are varying in cost by 300 or 400%, where in truth they're probably varying by 10 or 15%, but the data collection is not very good, and therefore the data that's collected isn't good. So certainly if Oflog were to look at data standards and to try to raise the way that data is collected so that everyone's data is more accurate, I think that would be useful.
And would the benchmarking clubs, which obviously CIPFA has, would that have a part to play?
Yeah, I think everybody would wish to respond to there being better data. So if Oflog would like to see, the metadata, the data about the data and how that's portrayed, and you tell people how to fill in forms more accurately so that you get less amplitude and you get the real difference between authorities rather than the way the data is being collected, that would improve the quality of our benchmarking clubs. It would include the quality of LG Inform. It would include the quality of the outputs of the RO form. So I think data quality is not as good for local government as it should be. The Home Office did an exercise quite a few years ago on improving police data, for example, and I would say I think police benchmarking data is more accurate than local authority benchmarking data because they did this piece of work on data standards. That would be welcome.
I think for me the big issue in sort of data, its management, its use is about behaviour around data. It's about the behaviour of people collecting that data and the behaviour of the people using it. And I agree with Rob. I think there is something that that Oflog could do about contributing to the development of a more positive culture and attitude towards data and its management. I think one of the looking back many years, the Audit Commission days, one of the problems with those days was that in the sector people collected that data without really having a mature attitude towards why they were doing it and what they were going to do with it once they'd got it. And it led to an environment of data use and management which was sometimes felt sort of disingenuous in terms of how data was used. I think there is a possibility that we could do more nationally to create an environment more supportive of strong corporate governance where we're using data and insight more effectively to have an understanding about where constraints lie. I think there's a strong role here for developing a better understanding of risk. Big theme in the sector at the moment. We're doing a lot of work on risk and councillors' understanding of risk particularly, but there's something that potentially could be done here on a national level to say how can Oflog help councillors and the public to better understand the various risks, pressures, constraints that councils individually and collectively face, and how can we promote a more candid and frank attitude to the way that we talk about those risks with government and amongst ourselves as a sector. The problem in doing that is that when government comes on the scene and becomes part of these conversations, people inevitably are going to become more reticent about being more candid and frank. And this is, I suppose, cuts into part of the challenge around the early warning conversations that Oflog is trying to have with people. The early warning conversations that you might be willing to have with government of a different nature, perhaps, to the one that you might be willing to have with your peers. And that's going to be a problem which I'm not sure has been fully grasped. That's that the willingness of people to engage, frankly, with government when people see government criticising individual councils for policy decisions or for other things that happen and don't really want to be in a similar position.
I think basically consistency and quality of data is key. And if you look at any accounting tool that's probably give the biggest bang for the buck, it would be benchmarking. You know, you could go all the way back to best value and the comparisons that were done during that time and everything that was built up from there. So I would think it's critical, and I think Oflog could play a leading role there. It seems to be an area that, or a space that they want to get involved in. And maybe if they could lead on that and it wasn't behind a paywall, maybe that could be useful. And then the question is, how would that data be verified? Because there's no audit here, and that's the difficulty.
It's amazing how many times in our conversations we go back to the Audit Commission. But I'm going to go back to the Redmond review into local audit. The government announced plans to create a new Audit Governance and Reporting Authority, ARGA, as a system leader. In your view, would it make more sense for Oflog to take over from the Financial Reporting Council as system leader rather than ARGA?
Yeah, I think it would, because ARGA's a little bit stuck itself, isn't it? It didn't get into the King's Speech, and so making FRC the system leader through the creation of ARGA has got a little bit stuck, but I assume that DLUC will give some mandate to FRC in the absence of ARGA being in the King's Speech. But FRC has a huge agenda to clean up corporate reporting and the concerns about corporate reporting and corporate failure, where a specialist body concentrating on local public audit and local public data would be a good thing. I think when Sir Tony made his recommendations, the response of the government was, we don't want to create another agency, and so they looked for an existing public body to become the system leader. But since then, the government decided to create Oflog. And so I think in time, I'm sure FRC will try its best to be the system leader. But if one thinks of Scotland, for example, where some of the problems haven't arisen that have occurred in English local public audit, the Auditor General of Scotland, through the Accounts Commission, has a direct role in the procurement and quality of local public audit, like the Audit Commission used to in England, and I think that works very well. So if my view is the single most important thing the government must get right is local public audit, then actually I would say having local public audit sit with the regulator that it's creating is probably more important than the other things that Oflog has presently been given to do.
So as Oflog, it appears that it's looking for a purpose and a reason for being. Would this be it?
Yeah, I think I don't think we can make easy promises here. I think local public audit will be broken for a little while, and obviously the committee has made reports on this and having the backstop date and starting the audit process again. But all of those audits will therefore open next year on a sort of disclaimed basis, and it will take several years for local public audit to recover. But there's no doubt that local public audit was a lot more than closing the accounts. The external auditor was a local public official who got involved in good governance and ensured probity and good decision making and brought things from other authorities. I would like to see all of that back. I think a specialist body like OLA, as Sir Tony recommended, or turning Oflog into that, would probably be a quicker solution than FRC. And that's not to discredit what FRC is trying to do, but it has got the whole of the corporate sector to sort out. And I think a specialist body on local public audit would be a good thing.
I see nodding heads there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Rob. I think it would make perfect sense for Oflog to take that space. It is fair to say in its draft corporate plan, it says that's not a space that it's currently in. But it would make perfect sense for it to step in there as the system leader. The biggest problem is there's not a system leader, and that's why the whole accountability system doesn't really work. And therefore, and this committee actually said that, I think the government's got to be clear what is Oflog's role in local accountability, and if Oflog isn't going to fill that, who is? And this committee actually said that last year, so we'll come back to the same thing.
Yeah, I think if there was a timescale for Argos establishment, then we might be having a slightly different conversation. But as it is, in the absence of it, what Rob's saying, the conversation that you as a committee had last year about local audits, the general unanimous understanding that there's significant challenge here that needs to be urgently resolved. It feels that fairly obvious to take the route that Rob and Laurence have agreed with. Yeah.
Could I just say one important thing? People get on about the Audit Commission, but if you look at the history of the Audit Commission, it's always very different things. Mm. People are on about the Audit Commission are on about really what it was at the very end. And it could be very useful for them to look back in the history of this organisation and go back into earlier forms of the Audit Commission. Mm. That would probably work very, very well now through something like Oflog, and that could be a potential way forward.
To start us then, just before we do, just to get your views, if I may, on the government's productivity plans which have been announced, and the establishment of an expert panel which will include Oflog and the LGA. What do you think the government's proposed productivity plans will achieve, and is it right that Oflog has a role in reviewing these?
I was very disappointed by what the government had to say on productivity because I thought it was rather simplistic, and I suppose it read like councils don't need more money, they should be more productive, and I think councils can be more productive and efficiency, but I don't think it covers the gap of the quantum, and I think we have to work hard on productivity and efficiency, but we have to talk about the fact that the quantum is inadequate in the way that it works for some authorities. The reason I thought it was disappointed is that one would hope that government would be joined up and create something fit for purpose for the future. There are two types of productivity: allocative productivity, do we spend money in the right place? And technical productivity, do we get more widgets for a certain amount of input? Other departments of government are very interested in allocative productivity. The creation of integrated care boards is to try and spend money on whole population health and prevention, because if you spend £1 on smoking cessation, you save £7 in respiratory disease 10 years later in our hospitals. And so not to think about the rest of government's agenda on productivity, the plans look like technical productivity, are there benefits through IT? And actually, a lot of medium-term efficiency will be had by investing in prevention. And the government itself thinks that because it's created integrated care boards to bring local government and social care together. But that doesn't feature in the scope of the productivity plans from what I've read. And I think that's a real omission. It looked fairly straightforward. And if you only focus on technical productivity and efficiency are different. You can produce more widgets for the same amount of input, but if they haven't got the right quality, you lose efficiency because you have to do the work again. And so I think that the government encouraging and giving good practice to local government on productivity and efficiency means the creation of some new tools. It means thinking about how do we deliver integrated care and bring pooling of budgets and investment in prevention. A straightforward, please do a productivity plan, and I'm sorry, this is where I mustn't appear angry, but I promise the committee that the number of equalities and diversity officers in local government is not going to solve the problem of its quantum. It looked pretty simplistic to me, and not a serious way forward to look at productivity.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things when you look at it, there doesn't seem to be any linkage between the different parts of economy, efficiency and effectiveness. They certainly never look at equity and fairness in any of this. And so I think the plans are, haven't went into the detail that they possibly could. And then in terms of, could Oflog have any role in this? Obviously Oflog could review these from a performance point of view, but it comes back to the thing we've always said. Has it got this value for money capability. It certainly hasn't got a value for money audit capability within the scope. It's been very difficult for them to review that.
So I think there are two issues for me sort of here. The first is the issue that Rob raised around sort of allocative and technical sort of productivity, and I also think this is quite strange, particularly considering that DLUC itself has a particular focus on allocative productivity through the levelling up stuff about the levelling up missions, and this is all about allocative productivity. And you'd think that the same department would bring that insight and understanding to what it's trying to deliver here. It seems to be happening out with the context of levelling up, which is still a policy one assumes. The second issue, though, is about how government expects these plans to be used. Now, going back to what I said at the start, my assumption would be that the most value that you get out of this exercise would be by taking these plans, identifying themes, drawing out an understanding about where pressures, constraints, issues arise for the sector as a whole. That's I think the sort of greatest benefits at a national basis. My sort of worry is that you'd see productivity plans being used as a mechanism to identify individual councils that government thinks on the basis of that plan are not doing sufficient to be productive. And I don't think that those plans would in and of themselves be enough for government to be able to make that judgment, but I think the temptation would be there to do so. I would hope that the use of the panel will help to bring a bit of sophistication to this, because, I mean, Oflog has wanted to and has been engaging with the sector, with membership bodies, with national bodies and with individual councils on how it's going to develop its approach here. And I would hope that would continue through the panel process to develop a greater level of sophistication. For example, you could see productivity plans being used by individual councils alongside the annual governance statement, for example, as part of, as an adjunct to their annual governance statement, to get a greater sense of where some of the opportunities, risks, threats, strengths lie in respect of transformation, change, financial resilience, these kinds of things. That could be useful, but just as a tool for government in saying your productivity plan isn't sufficient, so you need to do X, Y, Z, I think would be a blunt tool and wouldn't probably. But part of the problem is at the moment that we simply don't know enough about what the productivity plans will be, other than the very, very limited amount that's in what Oflog has already produced.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on, Natalie.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm looking at the identification of the financial problems and the role of Oflog in that moving forward. The government has clearly formed the view that some local authorities don't know that they're in trouble or don't know that they're in trouble early enough. So I'm interested within that priority remit that they've set out in terms of warning local authorities of risk. Do you think this is a realistic role that Oflog will be able to fulfil? And how do you think they're going to be able to get the information, both in terms of data and soft intelligence, in order to allow them to do that role effectively?
The soft intelligence is really very important, isn't it? So, what is the system of local government improvement? Councils are responsible for their own improvement, but they are accountable to some regulators such as Ofsted and CQC for certain services. They are accountable to their auditors. If they believe they need help, they can approach the LGA or CIPFA or somebody else. And now we have Oflog in the midst saying, if a council is in trouble but isn't speaking to anybody else, we will identify them and give an early warning to them that they should be seeking help from someone. I think that's essentially their role. I think that needs to be worked through, Mrs. Elphick, because soft intelligence, where councils talk about their concerns and that they may not have the capability that they need, is quite difficult at times to do with a regulator. On the other hand, might they speak to CIPFA or LGA or somebody else, and that's discussed with the regulator in an anonymised way? I think all of that has got to be worked through. Sharing intelligence is a good thing. I think I've sat in this committee and you've asked a number of us from different bodies, why did Northamptonshire or Slough or somebody fall over when you all individually thought that council would fall over? And so sharing intelligence is a good thing. Is that a role for Oflog, or is that a role for LGA or someone else? I think we have to work through, because people might not want to tell a regulator what their concerns are. However, the public has a right to think that somebody is collating that information and that we're sharing intelligence, and we try and have an early warning system for them.
And I think, just exploring that a bit further, there are other situations, though, where it is the regulator that someone would be telling. So I think financial services,
yes,
there is an overriding obligation of openness to a regulator if there are regulators, if there are difficulties. So yes, is that part of a cultural change that needs to happen?
Yes, of course, it is something that one should be doing with one's auditor if audit is fit for purpose. And so I can only agree with the premise of the question, but I do come back to the point that the single most important thing is that audit needs to be effective again. And I don't think Oflog can fill the gap that audit leads behind. But of course, public bodies have a duty of candour, and if the government deems that Oflog should share intelligence between LGA, CIPFA and other people where there are concerns about that, then we need to make that work. And public bodies have a duty of candour. We can't hide our secrets. So I do think we'd have to find a way to make that work.
Thank you.
There seems to be lots of bodies doing exactly the same role again. I mean, that makes it slightly difficult. But this is an important area. I mean, financial resilience can be looked at through things like data analytics. They have managed to spot some authorities that have issues there. I mean, CIPFA has a financial resilience model. There's duties for a long time on local government. So if you're the Section 151 officer, the finance director, they would have a duty of care if the thought things were in a bit of a mess to issue a Section 114 notice, or to at least highlight that there's a problem. I think things like governance in general is broke down quite significantly in local government, and I think a lot of them problems spring for the fact that local authorities' financial situation is quite difficult, whether that's in terms of the reductions in central government grant or issues around things like national and domestic rates. It's difficult now with things like the internet to really get that kind of funding, and council tax goes back to 1991. So if you have them kind of problems and you start looking at it, there's a whole range of problems here, and not just who can possibly identify that. I think all them things have to be put back into place and make them work. So my argument would be a lot of these duties already exist. It's just actually getting the right behaviours back in place.
And I think just pressing on that, do you think therefore that Oflog isn't going to add anything to this, or do you think there is potential for Oflog to have an additional role in identifying potential financial distress, for example?
I think the way it's set up at the moment within its corporate plan, it's going to be very difficult for it to do anything. I think if Oflog became the system leader and was properly resourced, I think it could make quite a large improvement.
Thank you.
So what both Laurence and Rob have said, it emphasises the point that this is all about Oflog being part of a wider assurance framework in the sector. So inevitably there is going to be some cut across here, because there are a lot of different people and organisations involved in having these kinds of conversations with councils, membership bodies, national sector government itself to understand, because government holds, the Secretary of State holds this really, really important and quite wide-ranging power relating to best value, to intervene in local authorities, to issue best value notices. Oflog can make sure, I think, that where that power is exercised, or where the Secretary of State is minded to use that power, it's doing so on the basis of more consistent, more systematic evidence, which Oflog is going to be able to produce and provide. And that, I understand, I think using that to ensure that Oflog is part of that wider sector conversation about what failure potentially looks like, where risk leads to failure, is a conversation that government's been having with the sector for some time. But I think that can only be a good thing ultimately. But I think we need more sharing and a greater shared understanding of what that looks like, and therefore what early warning conversations look like within the sector, rather than what Oflog's early warning conversations look like, or what the LGA's early warning conversations look like. And I think, so that work needs to be coordinated, because I agree with Rob. I think there is it's a different kind of conversation, the conversation that you'd be willing to have with government to those that you'd be willing to have with your peers. I mean, that's just human nature. And I think we can perhaps think of a way through that gives government the assurance it needs, because it needs assurance, because it's got, of its role, while also making sure that the sector is able to manage and support and develop its own improvement, because it's important. We are still working within this environment of sector self-improvement that we know works, broadly speaking, although in recent years has come under significant challenge. I think managed that way, you could see an approach and a system that would work.
So just looking back at the stated priorities, and I'm just very interested at how you have expressed that, because the priorities, as we've explored, are looking at warning local authorities themselves of risk and supporting local authorities at risk. But it's very interesting in our earliest session with the Minister that his own remarks in relation to whether or not 114 notices would be prevented in his remarks were that he would say that it would help advance the broadest and deepest understanding of demand and need in allocation, which I think supports the interpretation that you've put on this, that this is something which is going to be of particular potential use to government in terms of its allocation and resourcing and responsibilities, but it's framed as if it's a resource to help local authorities, isn't it?
I think in reality, the situation is going to be that this is going to be Oflog is going to be excising functions that are going to assist government in undertaking its duties and fulfilling its own statutory responsibilities. I think Oflog is going to be able to do work which will be of use to the sector and will be of use to individual councils within the sector. I think you look at the way that productivity plans, the way that these early warning conversations could be carried out in a way that will support individual councils, the way that we can work together with Oflog to understand better and more consistently what early warning signs of risk and failure look like, that's great. But I do tend to think fundamentally that this body, this organisation, is going to be one which is looking at the whole assurance framework, looking at the whole sector. The work that it does will inevitably end up being work that supports government to get a greater, more nuanced and more granular understanding of where some of those stresses, pressures and risks lie, so that government is then able to make public policy choices that better reflect its understanding of those risks.
Could I add something, please, Chair? This is probably, I should stick the word allegedly at the front of my sentence. If one thinks about the 114 notices that we've had, would Oflog have led to them being avoided? Possibly Northamptonshire, a sort of straightforward, not making enough savings, spending too much money, running into reserves. I'm not sure that Oflog would have noticed the misapplication of minimum revenue provision at Slough, or the misapplication of inter-authority lending at Thurrock. It may have noticed the monumental scale of borrowing at Woking, but Treasury had probably noticed that too. So I think the system leader point is key. I can remember raising with an auditor and about the misuse of MRP, which they were signing off. And of course, they reasonably said, "What business is it of yours, Rob?" I don't think they would have said that to the Audit Commission, which was a system leader on making sure that there was standard application of treatment as they signed off accounts. And I do believe that a system leader for local public audit questioning what are you doing on minimum revenue provision, what are you doing on inter-authority lending, what are you doing on various other dodges that I'm afraid we've seen that have led to terrible consequences for those authorities on their failed ventures. The sharing of intelligence with the system leader is a really important thing. Straight data probably may have saved one of these 114s in Northamptonshire, but the others were a lot more, weren't they? Governments were making quite poor decisions around detailed transactions that Offlog probably wouldn't have added value to.
Thank you very much.
Okay. About these early warning conversations, Mary.
Thank you. Rob, if I may come to you, early warning conversations. Do you think Offlog's early warning conversations can offer anything to local authorities that CIPFA's package of support and training does not already offer?
Well, if there are authorities that are not talking to CIPFA about their concerns, then the answer to that would be yes. I think the majority of councils that are under financial distress talk to CIPFA, talk to LGA and talk to others. I think the importance of Offlog is that it is a regulator raising the concern rather than the authority itself raising the concern and asking for help. And so I guess the premise for Offlog has to be that shining a light on some authorities will get them quicker, will get them to have help more quickly than they presently get through asking for that help. I don't know the evidence of that. I mean, that's the premise, isn't it? I do think CIPFA, as many authorities have gone, have sadly failed financially, there's a larger number that we've helped avoid that. And in a way, I'm very proud of that work that we've helped so many people avoid 114 notices. If the regulator had existed, it comes back to my answer to Mrs. Elphick. If the regulator had existed, would it have stopped some of those 114 notices? Probably not. And so, because it comes down to what Laurence said, because it's been given such a limited scope, in order that it doesn't scare the horses, or in a way, it's hard to see it being very effective as its present scope stands.
I think there's one more thing on early warning. I think a lot of the time the early warning's on the financial side, but various different performances of different services fall over. And maybe if some of those were addressed more quickly, that might be very worthwhile. So I think that could be worth looking at, whether it's adult care or children's services in certain parts of the country. I think that's one of the problems with early warning. It's got to be on the performance, not just the financial.
So what should an effective early warning conversation entail in practice? What should it look like?
It would look like authorities that are a few years away from needing a capitalisation order, where they will already be talking to government, and Offlog will not intervene in those conversations. So it would look like authorities that are 2 or 3 years away from that problem are presently not in discussion with the government or CIPFA or LGA, being warned that their data is going the wrong way and that they should have a conversation with somebody because they're a couple of years off that. I mean, I think logically that is the value that would be added if they do this correctly. I think authorities that are about to fall over are already in discussion with government.
So these are straightforward conversations with the finance officer going to government?
Yeah. I think, certainly for me, I think it's about government, Offlog being able to use some markers to be able to make a determination when performance or financial problems or other problems have progressed to an extent where those conversations are necessary. So you're taking on the data analytics that are produced by others, work carried out by the LGA as part of the corporate peer challenge process or other mechanisms of sector self-improvement, and then taking that and introducing a little bit of formality to the improvement activity that goes on around it. So at the moment you can have authorities that have an adverse Ofsted rating, and then they have a corporate peer challenge, and that has a slightly iffy result, and there are other issues floating around in the mix about member behaviour, and there are a number of different organisations and agencies who are variously involved in providing support to that. Government might be one of them. I suppose the early warning conversation might provide an opportunity to bring that together and understand what holistically is being done to understand the broad challenges faced by this authority on a corporate basis. Because a lot of these issues for us come back always to corporate governance, behaviours, attitudes, member-officer relationships, which often aren't surfaced by inspections by Ofsted or CQC or by others, or a surface, but in a slightly round the houses kind of way. So I think there is a way here of those early warning conversations becoming a focus for stronger direction on improvement that sits slightly under the formality of the best value environment, but that provides a way of escalating still. Because at the moment we have a gap between the less formal systems around sector improvement and the high formality of the best value system. And government has tried to fill that gap through the use of various different kind of improvement kind of panels and different kinds of informal oversight and improvement things, which it's tried to introduce in places like Birmingham, places like KNC with the Grenfell Task Force and that kind of thing. And I think the early warning conversation model could be an anchor for a form of sort of light touch support, which falls short of intervention, but which still is more targeted and focused than perhaps what we have now.
In other parts of the public sector, of course, that help comes with some money. So if a local authority is going to balance its books, adult services, children's services, SEND and temporary accommodation are the four pivotal pressures that it has to manage. If you think about a police constabulary or an NHS trust, if they are identified as having a problem with their significant pressures, then on the whole, the equivalent of offlog or the conversation with the regulator involves some support and resource being made available to help turn that around.
Thank you.
Just in terms of the early conversations, should they be formalised and publicised?
Well, that's a really good question. I think what Ed just said, of course, is it becomes formalised at the point of a decision by the Secretary of State to have a best value inspection. This is sort of the yellow card phase.
I was going to ask whether it was your yellow card.
It's sort of the yellow. So councils may give themselves a yellow card with a 114 notice or something else, but this is almost a yellow card by a government agency or a regulator saying, we think you'll be in a bad position. I can see the case for that being made public, so long as it's felt that it's impartial and entirely fair. And therefore, if Offlog were going to have that role, Mr. Betts, I think I would argue it mustn't be a part of the department and it has to be at arm's length and it must be independent of the Secretary of State in all the ways that the Audit Commission was, because if the Audit Commission thought that it would carry out some best value inspection because of its concerns, it was impartial and independent. And so I think the proximity of Offlog to government at the moment might inhibit its ability to give a yellow card in a way which is respected.
Right, moving on to the issue of informing the public. Yes, Natalie.
Thank you, Chair. So one of the key strands of this work is to try and inform the public, and one of the key tools of that is the Data Explorer. Do you think that this is going to be effective in ensuring that that the public is informed in a way that the public can actually understand what its local authority is doing, ask the right questions, and engage properly with the local authority or local authority areas that it lives in?
Well, I think we all have a duty to make sure that it does do that, if that's the intention, because it's good for the public to be able to understand the cost and performance of the services they're receiving, and to some extent the whole transparency agenda at times means that there's a load of information dumped on the public, which is quite hard for them to navigate and come to an informed decision. And so this really is an area where working with the sector itself around a common goal of helping the public to understand the quality and cost of services is something that we should all sign up to, but it will require investment and work and sticking with it, because we haven't succeeded so far, have we, in helping that to happen. But I think it's a laudable aim, and the more that the public can make informed decisions about their council and ask questions of the council, the better that is.
Yeah, I think the Data Explorer will be a start for the wider conversation that Rob has just talked about, and that I agree is necessary. I think that, as a sector, local authorities will say, and are right in saying, that they do a lot of work to try and engage their public, to explain to their public what they're doing in their name, that certainly the sort of electoral accountability sort of looms large in councillors' minds, and by extension with senior officers. But I think we do need more consistency in how we use data to support and have those conversations. But the Data Explorer on its own won't obviously do that. We as I think as a sector, individual councils and national sector bodies will need to think about how we're using that data as part of a way to support councils to have that conversation.
Right, so is it going to help citizens understand what's going on, or are we going to have a reductive technical productivity discussion?
Yeah, I mean, the transparency agenda was meant to create this world of armchair auditors that never materialised. So that didn't happen. Some people use this data or misuse the data and misinterpret the data. That leads to other problems. So I think you need either a proactive local media or some intermediary, which could be Offlog, to interpret the data for the public. The Data Explorer at the moment is fairly basic. It covers 5 or 6 what they've called themes, but it's services effectively, like adult care or waste management. And the data is very minuscule, and it looks at a very small amount of a service. It doesn't look at services even overall. And just to come back to my point earlier, we used to have systems that look not just at services, but at whole organisations and how those organisations fit into a place. And if this organisation is meant to help local authorities be a place-based leader, which it specifically says in its draft corporate plan, that Data Explorer doesn't do that. And it's certainly not contextualised in any way whatsoever for citizens. That's not to say that shouldn't be where they try to get to. It's just to say at the moment it doesn't happen.
And in relation to some of that best practice, at the moment we've got LGA Inform, we've got the CIPFA mechanisms, and I know a lot of work has gone into that, particular Rob on the CIPFA nearest neighbour function, to actually help people have useful comparators between local authorities. And I'm mindful that in Offlog's priorities, they say that their Data Explorer should complement rather than duplicate other dashboards and outcomes frameworks. How do you see them building on the very extensive work that's already happened? And do you think they can? Do you think they can actually get more from the sort of work that's in place at the moment?
We hope they don't duplicate, because there are a lot of good data sets that have been worked on over the years. And also we have codes, the Financial Management Code or the Prudential Code. I wouldn't like to see all of these duplicated, so that there are 2 sets of rules on how does one have effective financial management, for example. So it will be through Offlog working in partnership with the present providers of data. In an ideal world, the intelligent curator produces reports on what you can learn from the data as well that helps the public. My local authority is introducing a parking zone, a 20-mile-an-hour zone in my area, and if I think it will save lives, I will happily pay more to have it. If I think it's just income for the council and it makes no difference to whether or not people don't get injured, I'm not too keen on it as a resident. Do you know what? I can't sort of find out, are these zones a good thing and do they save lives? The Audit Commission used to do national studies as well as having benchmark information, and so I think Offlog moving into the place of what does good practice look like, but what are the trends that we see, being honest, public bodies have lost productivity in the last 5 years. Children's placements are more expensive, care packages are more expensive, agency staff are more expensive. Correcting backlogs of work that built up because of COVID, say, are more expensive than if they'd been dealt with at inception. So we're in this unattractive place where the public sector has lost productivity. We need to understand that. How do authorities get through backlogs of work in a cost-effective way rather than spend money? How do they not pay £18,000 a week for a child placement that a decade ago was half that cost? So there is genuine assistance that Oflog can give to help share good practice on productivity and efficiency, and I would like to push it in the direction of the national studies that the Audit Commission used to do, which is relying on good data but then helping to understand it and learn from it.
And in terms of that context, Laurence, I'm going to come to you. Is it possible to have such a thing as an impartial commentary on this, on data? And are there any examples of the public being able to use tools in other arenas that actually might have utility here? So sort of two parts to that. Is there such a thing as impartial commentary in this space?
I think a body can be impartial and be respected and seen as impartial. I'm sure CIPFA and the Centre for Public Scrutiny were both...
Everyone dislikes us.
Like to think that they're impartial commentators. So I think that can be the case, and I think that's probably necessary. You could argue the National Audit Office is seen as being quite independent and respected, and certainly at parts of the Audit Commission's existence it was at different parts in time. And like I say, if you look back to the earlier Audit Commission, they did do, although it wasn't called data analytics in them days, that's effectively what it was. They were using mathematical techniques and that to work out improvements in supply chains around local authorities. And them things were respected, which is the national studies Rob refers to. The problem there is you would need some value for money expertise, if not some kind of value for money audit. That's the problem.
So I sort of agree with part of that, but what I would say is that with this stuff and with public policy generally, there's rarely a sort of single version of the truth. Everything is about, a lot of this is about subjectivity. A lot of it ultimately, because we're talking about democratic institutions, is about political choices. So what this can do is by collating, bringing together evidence and data, you can identify links and identify causes and effects in like the way that Robert set out, in a way that makes it easier for politicians and the public to make those kinds of choices. So people can then bring their own views and perspectives on things, their own political views, ideological views, whatever they may be, and use the data to be able to have conversations about these kinds of things locally, what works, what doesn't work, what's important to us, what isn't important to us, based on data, informed by data, but not driven entirely by data, because it's all about that blend of what the data tells us with what our own subjective personal views and experience tells us as well. And I think that is a space where this could play a really, really important role in contributing to conversations between politicians and amongst the public about the kinds of public policy interventions that we're trying to make. I don't think data is never ever going to be sort of as front and centre as we might like in those conversations. But the more that we can try and aggregate, collate it, have the tools at our disposal to be able to understand what works elsewhere, how other people do things, and to bring those into the conversations we have locally, I think the better.
So just to run that off then, in terms of Rob's example on the traffic control zone, it might be the saving of lives, it might be revenue generation, it might be contribution to air pollution, and it's about having the information available in a way that people can access. Is that?
Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon, and I think it's been a very interesting and informative session for the committee. We're going to follow it up now with some representatives from local councils, and then eventually we'll have the Minister to follow up the points you've made with him next week. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Right.
Chairman, would it be considered rude to remove my jacket?
No, that's fine. It's rather warm in here. We've already had that conversation beforehand.
Okay, I might just take my leave then, if I may. Oh. Really interesting. I really enjoyed that, actually.
Right, okay. Right. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. That'll be our second panel. You've probably, I think, been at the back and heard the first panel deal with the questions we've asked about it. So, as we just begin, as usual, if you just go down the table and say who you are and the organisation you're here on behalf of this afternoon. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Councillor Abby Brown and I'm the Chair of the Innovation and Improvement Board at the LGA.
Chairman, good afternoon. My name is Trevor Holden and I'm the lead Chief Executive for the District Councils Network, representing all districts and some unitaries across England.
Good afternoon, Chair. Keith Stevens, Chair of the National Association of Local Councils.
Hey, thank you, all of you, and you're very welcome this afternoon. So, you've heard the conversation we've had so far about Offlog. Could you say what's your authorities, either individual or the collective authorities that you're representing this afternoon, what's their engagement so far with Offlog been, and how valuable do you think it's been? I'll just go down the table, Abby, first of all.
So I think we've had quite a high level of engagement with Offlog to date. I think all credit to the Chief Exec and the previous interim chair that they've attended numerous times at a whole variety of different events at the LGA, everything from attending our Councillors Forum, which is a coming together of the senior councillors who sit on committees and various other things, right the way through to attending political groupings, as well as, of course, speaking at the LGA conference and a whole variety of other things. We've had quite a high level of engagement with them at numerous points along the journey over the last 18 months. I think, obviously, as time has gone on, that's meant that we've developed an even richer dialogue and a better relationship with them. And I think that's been very helpful, really, and I think I would probably point particularly to things over the last maybe 6 months or so in terms of us getting a better understanding of their intentions and equally how we can work even better with them moving forward.
Right.
Yeah, Chair, so I would echo the comments that have just been made in terms of the engagement, particularly of the Chief Exec and the former Chair of Offlog. The relationship has been developing and starting from one of scepticism to actually how do we work constructively together, and certainly through the District Councils Network, all the two authorities for which I'm Managing Director, that conversation has shifted over the months to one of constructive engagement about making sure that and lobbying for the independence of Offlog and making sure that we avoid as far as possible duplication between the work that Offlog purports to be headed towards and, of course, the good work undertaken by our colleagues in the LGA around sector-led improvement.
Right, Keith, do you have a different view of the world from the local council point of view?
Yes, but we've been invited by Offlog to join talks and they've been very helpful. But I think from the important viewpoint is that it is Offlog, it's the Office of Local Government, and a whole tier of local government is missing from that. The parish and town councils aren't included at this time in the Offlog data gathering. We are obviously involved in talks and we're trying to get more involved because I think to get a true picture of what's happening in some local government areas, you need to have all three tiers involved, and parish and town councils have an increasing part to play, and of course they have increasing funds.
Just come on that point and I'll come back to the other witnesses in a second. But from a local council point, do you really think your members will be enthusiastic if Offlog came along and said, By the way, we're going to ask you to now collect all this extra information and data so we can publish it on our website. Is that what local councils really want to do?
I think local councils would want it, but not in one fell swoop. I mean, there's 10,000 parish and town councils, which would be overwhelming, I think, for Oflog. But it could start with our top 100, what I call super councils, that have a precept of $1 million plus or a turnover in excess of 1.5 million. I think they would like to put information in. At the moment, our data on parish and town councils is very fragmented. It's held in various parts because we're not part of the Data Explorer.
Right, so is that data you have or data you'd have to go about collecting if Oflog has?
We would have to collect some of it. Some of it is available. Obviously, the finances are available with SAAA, but other parts are in different parts of various organisations.
Right.
And
Andrew was one forward.
Why do you want more regulation?
Because, as I pointed out, parish and town councils are growing in size and importance, in my view, and we have to have the same control to see what's happening to, for example, Oflog, to my view, is an early warning system, is one of its big things, and you'll be able to spot trends of going on and be able to take action. At the moment, we tend to only take action when a parish council or a town council's got into trouble. Whereas with collecting more data, and that's what I've been stressing to the Oflog teams, that we need to collect more data. But to collect data is not an inexpensive task. And of course, towns and parish councils are self-funding. They don't get government money as my other colleagues do.
Well, there's no government money, is there? It's all taxpayers' money, whether it's your local taxpayer or through general taxation.
Yes, but we collect our monies through precept, whereas, take the LGA, for example, they get 19.2 million, I think today was announced, to help them do various things, and we would like to have the same. Otherwise, it means putting up the precept to collect data.
So why don't you not put the precept up and not collect the data?
Why don't
you not put the precept up and just carry on as you are and trust your members to be responsible in their own right?
Because collecting data is not an inexpensive task, and it takes time. And remember, a lot of councils have part-time staff. They're not all wholly staffed. Yes, the bigger town councils, and that's why I think a starting point would be to use the town councils that are in what we call our super parish councils.
Okay, I think Trevor Holden is itching to come in and respond to that.
Thank you, yeah. Indeed. So in my introduction, I didn't mention that I'm Managing Director for Broadland District Council and for South Norfolk District Councils in Norfolk, so a serving Chief Exec in my own right. We don't want more regulation. We want the regulation that we've got to be applied effectively, building on a strong sector-led improvement model. That engagement with Oflog, the initial question, absolutely, but it now requires follow-through and requires follow-through in delivering on some of those really positive conversations we've been able to have with the Chief Executive. So there is a gap in the market which your previous witnesses touched on, and that's that system lead, drawing together what the various regulators are saying about the place and performance. That data already exists. I'm sure that Abby will have a view which hopefully concurs, but LG Inform is a really, really good platform. If there are gaps in that platform, either in the data capture or the way the data is presented, those are the things we should be fixing, not creating another database. The point of independence is also really, really important in this space, to make sure that, and I'd liken it to a food safety inspector. So we have food safety inspectors going out and they undertake visits to food premises in the same way as we might do a corporate peer challenge. So they're going in, they're saying, producing a report, we think these things are wrong. The same inspector goes back some months later to say, have you done those things? No, you haven't. Oh, well, okay, now I'm giving you an improvement notice. Well, that's the place for the regulator before you end up in court, effectively intervention. It's the same person. We don't need to create a new bureaucracy or burden on the taxpayer for loads of new people. We've got people who do it. In your previous interviews with Lord Morse, I looked down the transcript and it said it's really, really important that it's visibly independent.
We'll come on to the issue of independence.
Sorry, it's intended to be small. And yet we then went on to hear that it's burgeoning 60, going up to 100 staff. Where does that end? It needs to be the system lead, small but perfectly formed, working with the regulators that already exist.
Come on to some of those details in a minute.
Thank you.
Just finally, from me, and just come to Abby first. Right, Oflog's working with you. Is it really listening to you? Could it listen more carefully, and could it better engage in terms of its approach?
I think in terms of whether it listens to us, I think yes. Is there more to do there? Yes, absolutely. I think what we've learned over the course of time is that you really need to have good quality conversations as opposed to just go through the motions. We've recently had our first political advisory group, which I think is helpful, but actually I think the real help and advice comes from the different types of conversations as opposed to the set piece full of people like myself to a degree. I think it actually is more beneficial when there is also alongside that the engagement with the rank and file of our sector, council leaders, chief executives and others actually as well. I think if there was to be one thing that I particularly drew out, it was the need for conversations with others beyond leaders and chief execs. At the moment, I think in terms of the individual personnel, absolutely no criticism at all. I think they've absolutely strained every sinew in terms of the chief exec and the previous chairman to engage with us. But actually, I think in terms of, as Trevor highlights, the other individuals who work for Oflog, you know, we have no real engagement with them and no real clarity, I guess, in terms of where they're going to and where that leads on to.
Okay. Anything to add?
Only that the actions need to follow the words. So really good engagement cannot criticise in any way, shape or form the leadership of the former chairman and the chief executive. Those need to be turned into words so that otherwise we run the risk of creating a massive bureaucracy over the top of something which will be less efficient and less functional than if we were to build on what the sector already has in place.
Okay. Let's move on to the issue of informing the public. Bob.
Yes, I mean, obviously the Oflog have come up with a view of having the local authority data explorer. What is your view of whether that will actually be transparent and enable the public to examine what local authorities do? Trevor, can you start on that?
I think the title just rolls off the tongue and every member of the public will be itching on their Google search to find it, or perhaps not. Yeah. I think if a member of the public was interested to see what was going on in their local authority, which hopefully they should be, they would probably start with the local authority's own website. Mm-hmm. Ties us back to LG Inform, ties us back to if there is a strategic piece of work, it's what does that front piece that every local authority should have on its website look like, which feeds the inquiring mind of the residents if they're asking.
So you raise LG Inform. Well, obviously that's a product that already exists. What differences do you see between the two databases, if any?
I don't, and I think as colleagues said in the earlier session, the data is interesting. As Josh would tell you himself if he was here, the data starts the conversation. It's the analysis of that data which stops people going off down the wrong road. So I don't think it makes a difference. I think there's a transparency issue for us in local government and actually a standard set of measures that were published front and foremost on a local government website. The data's all there, but you have to go looking for it. So maybe we need to have a standard way to make it easier for the resident, not just to see the data for their place, to make a reasonable also comparative.
That's always the key in these things. It's the aspect of the data's there, it's how you interrogate it and what you do with it. So, I mean, what would you see as being improvements that might need to be made to the Inform programme in order to provide the public with the sort of thing that Oflog want?
I think, as Trevor has already said, there's huge amounts of data there, thousands and thousands of different data sets. So I want to correct something that one of your earlier witnesses said, which was the implication that LG Inform is not actually free. It is entirely free, and you could log on to it now and look. But I think, as Trevor said, it can be at times quite complex. I was looking for skills payments for foster carers the other week in my local authority, and it came up with something like 9,000 different data sets, because actually there's a degree of expertise that you need to be able to use LG Inform. I think what's been quite interesting in terms of the debate over the last 12, 18 months that we as a sector have had over what Data Explorer is going to do versus LG Inform is actually perhaps thrown up to us that need to maybe look at how an individual non-expert user, and that actually could be myself, it could be Trevor as well as your average person on the street, how they get the value out of what is already there. But actually,
which presumably is the aim of Data Explorer.
Yes.
Whereas LG Inform might be considered to be for local authorities to look at, as opposed to the general public. Is that a reasonable?
I think that's fair, and I think it's a fair criticism that we perhaps need to reflect on ourselves as to whether we've maybe enabled LG Inform to be able to present the data in a way for the average user. There is an element of analysis in there, though, and it does come with a value for money report on every local authority as well when you log in. So the information is definitely there. Perhaps it's the interpretation and explanation we need to look at.
So, has anyone from the LGA looked at what the cost of doing all this would be? Because clearly there will be a cost. As Keith has mentioned, it's, money is provided to the LGA. And from my professional background before becoming an MP, knowing what the cost can be of doing such systems work can be very expensive indeed, particularly if you've got to change the whole system. So has anyone done any of that?
I don't think we need to actually change the whole system. The information is there. I think it's making it more in a more user-friendly way that you can type in straight away and get those figures, as opposed to ending up with 9,000 data sets to wade through. If you log in, if I went and logged in now for my local authority, it would come up with a top 15 report, top 20 report of those key things you want to know. How good is recycling in my area? What's the collection rate for council tax, business rates? How many children are there in care, and how would I compare those against comparator councils? I just think we've perhaps, in the course of our enthusiasm as a sector to want to collect data, almost overcomplicated what's there, as opposed to, as you say, looked at how to make it simpler.
What improvements would need to be made to Data Explorer to actually provide exactly what you're talking about? So have maybe two separate databases, the same database effectively, but just being interrogated in different ways. Any changes that you'd like to see?
I'm not sure really, because obviously Data Explorer is Oflog's product as opposed to our product. I think, and I think Trevor will probably talk about this, there's some of the data sets in particular that actually the way that they're collected actually is meaningless to a degree to members of the public. I think waste is possibly one of them, or fly tipping. It doesn't necessarily reflect the thing that the person on the street wants to hear. Increasing number of cases that you are collecting doesn't necessarily mean that fly tipping is increasing. It might mean that your team are more effective at doing it.
Fly tipping is very visible. That's the other issue. Sorry, Trevor, you wanted to...
Chair, but if I could take... If we were to accept that we have one database and it might be derived and used in different ways, hopefully that would free up resource from rather trying to build a new database to perhaps put other pieces of information, and I'm not saying reinvent comprehensive performance or area assessments, but crime and health might be also quite interesting to residents. And so actually, if we expanded what we've got rather than try and mirror it, perhaps we'd deliver better value for the public purse.
And the final thing from me is, obviously, the issue would be, should Data Explorer collect and publish data from first-tier councils, and would there be any benefits from that?
I think potentially there could be around this, and I think to follow up on the issue that Trevor has raised, one of the things that we have asked for is that wider place spend. within our areas, both within other authorities, so whether it's police or health, but actually indeed other government departments. It would be quite interesting, I think, from a local authority point of view to understand where DWP perhaps spends its cash and how that overlaps. So I think perhaps to go to the other end, you know, to a degree could also be helpful, couldn't it, for your average individual to understand what the spend is on first-tier councils too?
If you've been very quiet.
Yes, I share what my colleagues are saying, but as I said before, what we at the moment don't feed into Data Explorer. No. And I think that's what I'm talking and hope to carry on talking with Offlog about, that we should be starting to put information into that.
Is there a risk? I mean, obviously there's large numbers of smaller parish councils, and the data overload could be a real problem at one go.
That's why I gave the example that, if you excuse it, our super councils, of which there's just over 100, you know, with as I mentioned, a precept of over 1 million or a turnover of over 1.5 million. I think they could start feeding in, and that's the way to look at. That's a step forward, and we can see how that works, because I think it gives a truer picture of what's going on in an area to have all that information. And of course, local residents tend to know what's going on more with their local councils in the first tier or the upper tier, depending on which way you hold the triangle. And so I think it's important that they...
Is there a risk that if some of these councils started to feed that data in, residents might say, oh, what's going on with Council X? Because they're not feeding that data in. Have they got something to hide?
No, I generally don't think so, but I think the big thing, as I think I said, for the information that's being fed in, it's not always just the figures, but it's the trends, and it's being able to identify a trend early on that's out of sync with other councils, that really is the warning signal to, hold on, let's have a look at this and have a closer inspection.
Okay, well, I'll leave it then.
Okay, the role, of course, of Offlog is supporting local authorities. Mary.
Okay, Abby, if I may ask you, do you think Offlog's early warning conversations can offer anything to local authorities that LGA's corporate peer challenges don't already offer?
I think really probably to build on some of the comments that were made by your earlier witnesses, I think we see this as an element to a degree of additionality. I think Trevor gave an excellent example earlier of how perhaps we would see it. The department are keen for every local authority to have a corporate peer challenge every 5 years. That's something we as the LGA are keen to support with, and actually to date have been hugely successful over the last couple of decades in actually making it a really useful improvement tool. And of course, when you come to, we're looking to review that, we've recently brought forward some additional improvements to that. There's now a follow-up conversation. Again, and most of the time, councils act on that advice. There's a whole range of support that's available, again, as we heard earlier. But there is, unfortunately, the odd occasion where councils don't like that message. And however hard we can try and use our membership and our position to publish, for example, reports, we can't necessarily have the ability to make people do things they don't want to do. At the end of the day, I think, as one of the early witnesses said, councils are responsible for their own improvement. I think, therefore, there is potentially, isn't there, a gap, hopefully a very small gap, for those councils who actually can't reflect on themselves, where they are, and not necessarily prepared to take those actions themselves. And actually, there is that moment where sometimes it could be helpful to have somebody else, a regulator, to say, actually, do you know what, I think we really need to step in now and say to you, the advice that you've been given, the help that you've been offered, you've not really taken this, and actually things are not going in the right direction for you.
So is that where you see Offlog's role then, to be in that place? And how is Offlog going to identify specifically those local authorities?
I think certainly within the early warning conversation, as a potential follow-on from Corporate Peer Challenge, where there is a small number of councils perhaps who are not seeing that, I think there's a combination of ways that could come about. I think certainly from my experience, in terms of the improvement agenda, there are at least one, maybe two, three councils that you immediately kind of come to mind where you think, actually, we're offering them huge amounts of support, we're trying to have a conversation, they just don't really want to listen. Perhaps we could share that soft intelligence with Oflog, and that could be the basis of potentially an early warning conversation.
So what does Oflog need to do to ensure that those conversations are helpful to local authorities?
Well, I think some of it is understanding the work that's happened to date. A lot of the work that the LGA does, and again, I reference this in terms of early witness, in terms of CIPFA, is quietly behind the scenes. It's not always appropriate to go out and talk about those councils that you've helped quietly with issues that they might have had, but feel a sense of pride back at the ranch quietly behind closed doors about the fact that actually they have avoided exceptional financial support or other things, or that you've been able to help develop their members and officers moving forward. So I think there's something about understanding the support that's already there, both in an overt and also a covert nature. But then also, I think looking at some of the other indicators around some of the issues that are there, again, it was referenced earlier in terms of, for example, children's services, where that might fit in with a financial picture. Equally, what will happen in terms of CQC visits with adult social care and various other things really around there. But I think really generally reflecting on the assurance that is already taking place within the system.
Trevor, how do you think that the Oflog early warning conversations can be helpful?
So I think they should be part of a continuum in terms of corporate peer challenge raises some concerns, the revisit amplifies those concerns if they're not addressed. And there is absolutely a space for Oflog in terms of that coercive nature of having, well, if you don't sort it out constructively, well, we'll bring our big brother into the room who might just help persuade you because they've got a regulatory function. So I think if local authorities see that continuum of improvement, ultimately ending in intervention if it doesn't happen, I think those conversations would be more constructive and more open in terms of those people who don't want to have the conversation with a CPC. But they need to be, again, and goes back to my analogy of an improvement notice kind of approach. These are the things you've now got to do, because they would be external to the LGA family, independent of the government department, saying, actually, if you don't do this, some really nasty things are going to happen.
It makes it sound as if Oflog's role is going to be something of an enforcer, to be dreaded. Is this how you see it?
No, I see it as the precursor to stop the enforcer. I see the department making intervention as the enforcer. This is the slightly big brother to CPC, working hand in hand, and indeed my point earlier, potentially with the same people. It's just a different conversation, because we have to respect in all of this the autonomy of local councils to take decisions for themselves. Sometimes you just need a slightly firmer conversation to be able to accelerate that improvement journey.
Keith, how would your councils react, and what would the best early warning conversation look like to them?
I think at the moment, well, because not being part of the Oflog data, it doesn't come into effect for us, and that's why we'd like to, because at the moment we have to try and do that in-house. We are trying to improve accountability and sustainability of parish and town councils, and we do have a national improvement strategy where we go in and help, and this is endorsed by other organisations, including the Society of Local Clerks, and we work alongside the LGA on a lot of the improvement things that we do. But the issue tends to be that we don't get information until it's almost too late, and that's why we'd like to collect different types of data from various sources, which is what I'm expressing to Oflog, because that early, I keep using it, but it's those early trends that you pick up. Silly example with parish and town councils. Are there complaints being made to the monitoring office about parishes? Well, we don't hear about that until the problem's occurred, and then when you look back, there's been lots of complaints for it. A simple example, but it's that type of data that you need to collect as well as figures, I think.
Is there any feeling that these early warning conversations may lead to just an added burden on the council if they take part in them?
I think obviously Oflog themselves have said that they only anticipate doing a relatively small number. I think it is unavoidable, isn't it, whether it is to a degree a corporate peer challenge or an early warning conversation by Oflog, that there is an element of burden there on them being carried out. But I think the scale, certainly, that we've been assured that Oflog are looking to do is very small, and we would hope that within the circumstances, I think, that we've all described, it would merit that level of attention from the local authority, certainly.
We talked earlier about value for money, and one of the parts of this will also be productivity and the productivity plans which the government has, and the role that Oflog will have as the expert panel. What do you think the government's proposed plans for local authorities with both Oflog and the LGA's role in reviewing these will look like, and how do you welcome it?
Certainly from an LGA point of view, we've agreed to join the expert panel to advise government on financial sustainability in the sector. And obviously we'll be sitting alongside, we understand, other organisations, both internally and externally, to talk about that. I think we view that we'll be part of a panel looking at the wider strategy around this, as opposed to going through 300 plus productivity plans, which I think would present an unwanted additional burden for the sector, really.
What sort of optimism do you have for the outcomes of this?
Relatively positively, certainly from my conversations with colleagues within the sector. I think any good local authority has already been looking at how they can continue to be more productive, how they can look to transform their services, and certainly for us as an organisation, transformation is one of our 5 key pillars of sector-led improvement. However, I think there is also a need for them not to be onerous, and for government to be very clear that they won't be required for them to be onerous, because actually that's an unnecessary burden for us as a local authority.
Yeah, thank you. I think your earlier witnesses mentioned the kind of different levels. So is this about a system productivity? Early prevention was mentioned, so departments working with each other. If it unfortunately unfolds as a micromanagement of a local authority, then the very best that actually should be set within those parameters are some big ticket outcomes. So when we had historically the Gershon efficiencies, there was a percentage that you had to achieve of cashable or the like. So government setting big targets, but then the plan surely must be down to the scrutiny of local councillors, because they are the watchkeepers. And I'm really, really concerned that we go off down a road that disempowers local councillors. It's hard enough to get people to stand now. If you then say, well, actually, some of the stuff that you're here to do, we're going to take away and we're going to do that centrally. Whatever we do with productivity plans must be seen to empower and enable local councillors as locally elected leaders, and not be seen to be disempowering them and taking control to some another central body.
So how can that be achieved?
I think, if I can speak candidly, any outcomes required in a productivity plan should be big ticket efficiencies, i.e. a 10% efficiency in X, Y or Z, or actually a Y% improvement in recycling, etc. Leave the how that's delivered and the monitoring of that to the local councillors and their published performance data, because to do otherwise, one, you need to create a bureaucracy to manage those plans, and 2, you disempower your local councillors who are elected for that purpose.
Local authorities, in my view and my experience, have traditionally resiled from being told how much money they need to save and how much more productive they need to be, and given a target. So do you think that they would actually push back against that?
I think they would, but we stray into a wider debate, which is the cap on council tax, because ultimately the auditor is, of course, the electorate. And so I think it's about making the systems that we have work better, rather than putting a sticking plaster of something else over the top.
Thank you.
Just come back to the early warning conversations, and you were saying they should be part of a continuum. We asked the previous witnesses whether they should be formalised and made public. If they're part of a continuum, they would have to be, wouldn't they?
I think depending on the circumstances, you would ultimately get to that stage. But as Abby has already mentioned, some of those conversations will take... They're the first call to the headmaster's study to say, come on, Clive, you need to get your homework in on time before that's formalised in the report to mum and dad. So I think there's space for informal conversations, but the coercive nature of actually we need to do this the nice way, or actually it will become a public report. I think it's about management in the circumstances with all options on the table.
I think Trevor's mentioned courtesy before around this, and I think one of the things that we've seen as an organisation is actually the enthusiasm, shall I say, of certain local authorities who maybe have been slightly reticent to want to have a corporate peer challenge until they suddenly thought that if they hadn't had a corporate peer challenge within the 5-year window that the department recommends, and therefore they may have an early warning conversation, have suddenly decided they'd quite like to have one after all. So I think the challenge, to go back to your question, Chairman, is of course it would be very hard for them to be carried out without people knowing. I think it'd probably take about, 20 minutes between the first person from the early warning conversation turning up and everybody within that area knowing about it in terms of local authority colleagues. But the reality is that knowing that that could be a possibility will drive certain behaviours within itself, won't it, in terms of how people behave around that. And some of those things are quite simple. For example, having a corporate peer challenge and the help that is available as a result of doing that, which demonstrates that you're open to improvement, that you're open to talking to your colleagues, that you're open to having advice from other people. And of course there might be the odd one or two here or there which fits the model that Offlog are looking at. They only expect to be carrying out a small number annually, but they do themselves suggest that they want to publish at least the recommendations, if not the reports of these. So I think it's kind of that understanding, as you say, where on the continuum they are, and ensuring that the behaviours follow as a result, as Trevor describes.
Chairman, could I just add, it takes us back to that transparency issue, and the cold light of day has a massive sterilising impact. So if local authorities who have got a journey to go on thought that ultimately there is going to be a published set of recommendations or report, that in itself will be coercive in terms of improving that improvement journey.
Okay, moving on to the independence of Offlog. Andrew.
Thank you. So the question for all three of our panel. Do you think there are any risks to local authorities if Offlog continues to operate as a part of the department rather than an independent body? And what are those risks? Start with you, Abby.
I think there is always a risk, isn't there, if potentially there is the view that whatever is carried out has to be reflected back to ministers, or potentially there is the ability of ministers to influence what happens. I think, to give credit to the current Chief Exec and the previous Chairman, they've had a very good response to that question whenever they've been asked it, and to be honest, pretty much been asked it every time I've been in the room with them, probably at least 15 times over the last 12 months. But I think it is too much to expect two individuals to carry the weight of that. In actual fact, I think our preference would be really ideally to see Offlog as an independent organisation for their own credibility really within this, as well as of course the challenge that it presents to local authorities around potentially the view that a minister could have said, I think you should go and visit X council.
Yeah, I think this thing of independence, and Lord Morse said when he spoke to you previously, it's important for us to be visibly independent. I think that's really important for the sector to see that, so that Offlog can have a conversation down, but it can also have a conversation up, which is one of the things the corporate plan was referenced previously to say, well, we won't be lobbying. There's a difference between lobbying and identifying a trend back into government to say, actually, this service or this area is underfunded and needs something to be done. I think the Secretary of State, or no, actually within the report, the letter, it refers to the spirit of independence. And when I was prepping, I was reminded of a conversation with my long since departed father, who said when I was a young man, I want you to be really independent. I want you to do all these things, right up to the time that I wanted to come in too late, or that I needed a motorbike, because the department, the Offlog, will be seen as independent to a point, and that point will be controlled by the department. That won't do it any good. Ultimately, it won't help the department, and B, it won't help drive the sector-led improvement that we're looking for.
Yeah, I agree. An independent chair is seen as more credible, I think. And of course, Lord Morse was really helpful, and I'd met many conversations with him, and he learnt more, I think, about parish and town councils. He was unaware of some of the issues we had. He also thought we were funded through our colleagues in the LGA, but unfortunately I pointed out that wasn't the case. Sorry to keep mentioning funding. But yes, I think to be seen by the public to have an independent chair is very credible.
Okay, Keith, and just back to you, Keith, and go that way this time. Do you think local authorities have been more comfortable sharing information with Oflog than the department directly, given that Oflog's purpose is to signal for the department to take action if necessary in any case?
I think so. I think, again, for the meetings I've been at Oflog, it has always been stressed. It's not collecting information to use to chastise councils, but it's there to try and find the trends and what is needed. And I think that's the important issue.
Yeah, I think there's been much conversation from previous speakers around that system leader role. I think that lends it to have to be independent. Equally, I think that local governments will be much more open in conversations were they speaking to an independent regulator. One, because they have to, and two, because they're about fixing the problem rather than trying to avoid intervention.
I mean, finally.
I think it's worth making the point again that the information that's been used by the Data Explorer is not new information. It's data that's already published, that's been reused through there, and I think it would be interesting to see what would happen if they were to request specific data. Obviously, that would then create a burden on local authorities. But I think for the points that my two colleagues have made, really, actually, I think it's important that they are seen as being independent, particularly when it comes to soft intelligence as well. Around that, clearly we collect a huge amount of it as the LGA, but I think, as previous witnesses talked about, I think that openness to want to share challenges. Not all local authorities are kind of closed when they've got a challenge, are they? They're very open about it, and I think your response to that can be quite different depending on who you're speaking to.
How's Oflog going to deal with a situation where it hears that things are really, really serious and they're massive problems and sort of not tell the government or keep it quiet?
I don't think it's about not telling the government or keeping it.
Why don't they just tell the government directly then?
I think this is about, to go back to Trevor's example earlier in terms of the food hygiene inspector, sadly we find ourselves in a position where there are some local authorities who at the moment are potentially not doing the right thing, and how do we step into that space around doing that?
If I might, and the point that conversation takes place or should take place is at the point that actually we've been unable to resolve this. Now we need to trouble government with it because it might lead to intervention. So I think there's a point where that does happen, but by having an independent regulator gives you space to try and fix the problems before they need to bother busy ministers or busy civil servants because they're below their radar at that stage.
All right, thank you, Chair.
Can we move on to the question of the chair then? Obviously, Ms Morse had to stand down, so we're going to have another interim chair. Would you want the new interim chair to adopt the same approach?
Absolutely. I think, Lord Morse was very open and very enthusiastic to come in to speak to the sector.
Yeah. So very supportive of Lord Morse and Josh and the current direction of travel. So I think the terms of reference for that job are going to be really, really interesting, but would absolutely support someone in the saying, guys, equally, would welcome the opportunity, if this committee thought appropriate, for it to be an appointment through a subcommittee and for sector representatives to be able to support you in that journey.
Right. I mean, we're having discussions, I think, with the Secretary of State about the way in which a chair should be appointed. I mean, there are different models. One is that the Secretary of State does the appointment, which is what's happened so far. Secondly is a traditional one where the Secretary of State does the appointment, but then there's a confirmation hearing with the Select Committee, and that's what the local government ombudsman, for example, follows that route. Or there's a third way where the Office of Budget Responsibility. I think the Treasury Select Committee actually does the appointment there rather than the Chancellor. Have you got views about how independence should be demonstrated by the method of appointment?
So, Chair, first time I've run into those three options, so I don't know whether to phone a friend or ask the audience. But I think, given the level of interest that your committee has taken in this area and the evidence that you have gathered, the opportunity for you to participate in that process, your option 2, sounds like the most logical. I'm given to understand, and this is way, way beyond my level of knowledge, that if there were to be a subcommittee, you would be able to invite representatives of the local government to support you in that process. We would welcome the opportunity to do that.
I think that would be a new format that would have to get some approval. I mean, normally select committees don't invite others except other members of Parliament to join them in processes, but there are always, never say never, there are always new ways of doing things, as I think we all learn in political life. Is there anything else you want to add about the independence of the chair going forward? No. Okay. Thank you all very much for coming and giving evidence to the committee. I think it's an important subject which may not have captured the public's imagination yet, or indeed all council's imagination, but it's something that could lead, if properly done, to the improvement in the way that local government performs and the services that you deliver. So it is an issue that we will produce a report on, having listened to the Minister next week. Thank you very much indeed. Lord order, that brings us to the end of our public proceedings for today.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.